Today on Militaria at the museum, we'll get a history of a pair of coveralls that were worn by Canadian civil defense volunteers. Then, we'll look at two very successful types of torpedoes and discuss how one superseded the other. Lastly, we'll figure out what the wreckage of a famous World War II British fighter aircraft was doing in Atlantic Canada and how it ultimately disappeared. Beyond museum exhibits lies a hidden realm of archived artifacts that hold the keys to unlocking intriguing stories from the past. Come along as I meet with experts at the Army, Naval, and Aviation museums, where I've been granted special access to pull back the curtains and reveal the secrets of their militaria. My name is Sandy Hiltz, and all my life I've been captivated by military history. Now, I have the rare opportunity to explore a collection of fascinating military artifacts on Militaria at the museum. The Civil Defense Program, which was implemented during World War II and again during the Cold War, saw Canadians undergo regular training in preparation for a potential attack on the home front. I'm meeting with Shara Kingston at the Army Museum to see a pair of civil defense coveralls that were worn by civilians as part of the program. Shara, I understand you have some materials here at the museum relating to civil defense, and I was wondering if you could show me those and tell me a bit more about it.
I would love to show them to you.
Shara, thank you for having me here to Casemate 10 to discuss civil defense. I think it's sort of an untalked about part of our Second World War history. But tell me, why was the civil defense set up?
It actually was set up before the Second World War. I think people that were watching what was happening globally and following Hitler's march towards domination, and he had people starting to think about what could possibly go wrong. They didn't know the war was coming, but what could possibly go wrong?
Right.
So civil defense was a great way for communities to get together and work together towards a common goal to make sure everyone stayed safe.
So who would have found themselves a member of the civil defense that was set up?
It was a completely volunteer organization. The only people that were sort of hired per se were people that had made their way in the Army and were already kind of officers of some sort.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So these were already existing members of the military. How would this have differed from just the Army itself?
So who participated would have been those that were still at home.
Right.
It would have been women, some older children, but too young to really involve themselves in warfare. As well as those who maybe have served in the First World War and were either injured and or too old to serve.
What sort of form did this take? Were there sort of weekly meetings and training and so on?
There was a lot of training. So there was 4 levels of training. The first level of training is your own personal study. The second level was there were weekly meetings. And at the weekly meetings, we discuss what we read, what we know, what we want to do. Third level, all of us are coming together. All of us are talking about what we're going to do and how we're going to share resources and information. And the final is to work with businesses and government officials and start bringing them into the fray. So it was kind of like these tiers, and they would all work together.
Now, in terms of the training, is this something sort of like the militia? Like, would they be training with the rifles and so on? Or what were they doing?
There was no weapons involved, but you kind of had to teach all these people, particularly those that were in charge of their little neighborhoods, how are we going to protect women, children, the elderly from some of these attacks?
So a lot of this involved the threat of air raids and similar attacks.
Absolutely. And that's where it came in 1936, ARP, the air raid precaution. That was Canada-wide. They did things like watch for firebombs, do first aid training, and make sure that messages could be carried from community to community.
Sure, you have quite a selection of artifacts out here on the table for me to take a look at. Can you give me a brief walkthrough of what we're looking at?
So the federal government was in charge of ordering some supplies and have each province, each city sort of hand them out as they needed to. The gas mask kind of looked like that, and you would put it over your face.
Right. Clearly it was not something that he ended up having to use.
He probably used it in demonstrations because he
Right.
was a warden, so he would have
Right.
had to demonstrate certain things.
So there's a really wonderful selection of photographs here, Shara. What are they depicting?
So what they're depicting are training scenarios. So we have a group here laying on the ground, trying to defuse or I guess inspect what they think is a possible bomb, a firebomb. We have a situation where there may have been a building on fire, so they have to go and see what that's all about. Every community or segment of streets had their own
Right.
corps. So they're showing the group that's part of the fire brigade.
Right.
This is how you do it. This is what I'm looking for. He's also got his armband on. These are the armbands
Right.
that I was telling you about.
What is this one?
So this is the Hindenburg that flew over Halifax. Now it flew over in 1936, so kind of was a bit odd
Right.
that this balloon is now flying over Halifax. Why
Sure.
Halifax? And it flew quite low. As you can see, there's the tops of the houses.
Oh, yes.
So at 1,000 feet, people were kind of curious as to what was going on.
And then the beret here.
Yes, the beret. This is part of a collection that came to us from Weinman. He became a warden within his own section. This is his beret that has the W for warden. This was also his gas mask.
Would they have had a uniform of sorts, or was it just more the beret and the armband?
As I kind of was talking about how things were structured, everyone had a role. Now, if you were a little higher up and you were a warden, you would probably get a beret.
Right.
And then it depended also on what your job was. So Wyman would have had his own, well, he does. He has his own coveralls that
really?
we have in our collection.
Really? Oh, could we take a look at that?
Absolutely.
Oh, that would be great. So Shara, these are Wyman's coveralls. There's a lot of different things going on here. What can you tell me about some of them?
We know these are 1941 coveralls, your rank, your position, your unit, that sort of thing. So this was the symbol for civil defense,
Right.
the C, the D. In these nines and triangles was that was his district, that he was with District 9. And then we don't know a whole lot about these stripes other than what we believe, because they're very similar to military service stripes.
Right.
So was this the number of years that he served?
Ah.
And that's what we surmise.
There are 6,000 people just in Halifax serving in the civil defense. What are these people looking out for and guarding against?
Everything. So what they were most concerned about was fire bombs, incendiary bombs falling on their homes.
Right.
And then they were also watching for things like U-boats and what kind of explosions might happen. We are in a particular position, physically, geographically, where we're right on water.
Right.
So we were vulnerable to that as well. North Americans were in danger during the Second World War. One day after war was announced, so on the 3rd of September, there was a passenger ship that was torpedoed by the Germans, which alerted Canada to the fact that this could be a very real possibility that war could hit our shores.
What kind of impact did the civil defense have to people at home?
Basically what they were training people to do is, what would we do if? And so being able to know what you would do, I think would give them a sense of security. I know it would give me a sense of security, but it did lead further on down the line. It led us to start thinking about emergency measures.
Shara, as the war is coming to a close in Europe and it's becoming apparent that the Allies are going to win, what's happening to civil defense? Is it just disbanded, or does it continue after the end of the war?
So officially, it starts to disband in August of 1945. The War Department asks for their gear back. Obviously, some gear did not make it back, but actually there are some small towns that kept or bought out the government of their stirrup pumps or gas masks because they themselves felt better about having those things around, particularly auxiliary fire crews or
Right.
volunteer fire crews. They wanted some of those items. This is the lead up to the Cold War, and people started saying, hey, you know what? We learned some good lessons about training our civilians, and maybe we should keep on top of that. I think in the end, what civil defense did for us was it really got us thinking about emergency measures acts and emergency measures organizations. And so even today, looking at things like wildfires and sort of natural causes, having that organization of where would you go, what would you do, who would be in charge, how does that information disseminate, this leads into that. And I think we're better for it.
So we saw sort of higher level meetings during the Cold War, but we never did see the coming back of something like the civil defense that we had during
Not
the
to the
war.
same extent.
Right.
No, not the training, not the getting out there in coveralls
Right.
and getting down on the ground. But they still were thinking about, in this area, where would we evacuate? I know throughout Canada we have 6 bunkers because of those conversations. Someone saying, we can't continue to think nothing is going to happen.
Right.
We know that it did before and it may again, and let's get prepared.
Shara, thank you for taking me through the history of the civil defense today and allowing me to get an up-close look of these artifacts. It's certainly a history with which I was largely unfamiliar, and I've really enjoyed learning about it today.
It was my pleasure to show you. Civil defense was a great program to boost morale across Canada as well as locally here in Nova Scotia and Halifax, and was a good way for everyone to feel safe, that things were being taken care of and looked after.
Coming up after the break, I'll be at the Naval Museum, where I'll learn about the evolution from self-propelled to acoustic torpedoes and see examples of each type. At the Naval Museum, expert Rick Sanderson is going to show me some self-propelled and acoustic torpedoes. I'll explore how the addition of a collection of acoustic transducers improved the self-propelled torpedo by equipping it with sonar, thereby giving it the ability to locate and steer itself towards a target. Rick, I was wondering what you could tell me about the history of the self-propelled torpedo.
We have quite a bit of information in the archives, and we have a couple of examples here within the museum and on the grounds, but I think we need to go a bit further back than that, to the spar torpedo.
Really? So what can you tell me about the spar torpedo, Rick?
Well, the first use of the spar torpedo was during the American Civil War. It had a spar at the end of it, like a long pointy stick,
Right.
with a barrel at the end of that, which had munitions inside of it, and then another barb at the far end of that. It was actually rammed into the hull of a Union ship, and then they would back out and leave that behind with a fuse in it, and then it would explode. And the submarine was also lost as well because it was human propelled, and they suddenly opened themselves up. So that was a submarine use of it, but the Whitehead torpedo was both for submarine use, but also for deck mount.
So this submarine that was delivering the spar torpedo, Rick, it was actually human propelled.
There was between 6 and 8 Navy personnel who were sitting along a bench with a hand crank like this that was turning the propeller. It would go forward and it would go back, but it wouldn't do much in between. And that would be rammed into the enemy surface vessel.
And so how widespread and heavily used were these?
Hardly at all. The first one was a failure, and they lost the sub.
The spar torpedo, not very effective. What do we start moving into after that?
Whitehead was the designer, and he was taking information in order to design a torpedo that was self-propelled. The self-propelled torpedo is a weapon that is launched from on board a ship or from a submarine, and it has its own internal power capacity, and it has a warhead and a propeller, and there are devices on board that will keep it running in straight line. Gradually, a number of different marks of greater power, greater speed, greater distance. This one was actually designed to be fired from the deck of a destroyer or a battleship. And this came to us from Dalhousie, and Jackie Fisher was a big proponent of the torpedo and the submarine and not so much of the battleship. He thought the naval guns was a thing of the past. So he's a very interesting fellow in and of his own, but this torpedo is very closely connected to history within Halifax.
Rick, how does something like this work?
As soon as it comes out, that starts the motor running. There's a warhead up here that holds 200 pounds of explosive gun cotton. There's a very large compressed air tank in the middle, and the stern part of it holds a 3-cylinder motor and the gyroscopes and other instruments that are used to keep this thing going steady, not wavering from left to right or going up and down or diving into the bottom of the sea. So it's very complicated over the time that they perfected it, but it ends up with something very much like this. This is a Mark III Whitehead torpedo. There's a number of manufacturers around the world that were making these things, but they were superseded, used in the First World War, used in the Spanish-Franco War, used in the beginning of the Second World War as well. In order to work, of course, they actually had to hit the target, and quite often the torpedoes would miss. There were developments that were happening around the same time. One was actually a magnetic trigger, and that would fire off as the torpedo went close to a steel body. The main one that was most effective was the acoustic torpedo, and that actually homed in on the sounds of the motor or the propeller or other sounds within the ship.
Rick, this is a great example of self-propelled torpedo, and we've talked about the spar torpedo. What's coming after these technologies?
Overlapping this, both Germany and the United States were working on what's known as the acoustic torpedo, which was one that focuses on sound rather than on hitting it with the nose of the torpedo.
Really?
Yes.
Right. Do you have any examples of that?
We do have an example of a later version of it that's located over in base headquarters, and we can take a look at that one.
That would be great.
That's wonderful.
Rick, what exactly are we going to look at?
This is a good example of the mid-era development of the acoustic torpedo. This was a direct result of the Cold War. Acoustic torpedoes homed in on the sounds of the propellers, which is called cavitation, meant to pick up those sounds, turn direction towards the enemy vessel, and then when they get close enough, they can explode.
So Rick, what are the differences that we would see between this and the Whitehead we just looked at?
The technology involved in both weapons is quite different. The general shape of the weapon is very, very similar because that's what is effective. This thing has a microcomputer in it that's processing information, and it's searching out the target. The vessel that you're attacking can also release material into the water that will confuse this reading. So it's still the same problem now, is how are you going to counteract one of these things?
Rick, when does the Whitehead start to fall out of favor and we move towards things more like this, the acoustic torpedo?
This is 1956 through to 1980. There are preceding acoustic torpedoes, and there were acoustic torpedoes that were developed and used during the Second World War by both sides.
So the amount of time between the last usage of the Whitehead and this torpedo here is really very short.
Technology is very often increased by warfare.
Right.
This is a Cold War weapon.
Right.
There is another version of this that came along afterwards, almost identical to it, but it's got a totally different kind of technology.
Rick, thank you for taking me through the evolution of these various torpedo technologies.
You're very welcome. My pleasure.
When we return, I'll examine a wing rib from a Spitfire and hear the unusual story of how it was unexpectedly discovered on an island in the Halifax harbor. The Supermarine Spitfire is the most famous British fighter aircraft in history. It became a symbol of freedom by helping to win the Battle of Britain during World War II. I'm meeting with Museum President Mark People at the Aviation Museum to discover why a Spitfire wing was found on Halifax's McNabbs Island and to theorize about its mysterious disappearance. I have to say, Mark, I'm really excited to be here and to be able to hold a piece of the Battle of Britain in my hand.
It's kind of interesting. The artifact may not look anything, but it's the significance and the story it tells. It's like lots of artifacts we have in the museum. Unless you have the real true context, it makes it much more exciting when you realize what exactly it is.
Absolutely.
This piece, it looks like a rusty piece of metal, and in a sense it is, but this is actually history in our hands. It's a lightweight piece of Spitfire wing. The Spitfire was principally a fighter aircraft. It was designed to defend Britain, and it was designed to attack other fighters or bombers as they attacked. The wing was designed by a guy called Beverly Shenstone, who was actually a designer of the wing platform, which gives the Spitfire its unique elliptical design.
And this bore witness to the Battle of Britain.
Absolutely, and complete wing on McNabb's Island. At this point, this is the only piece that I retrieved of the wing. I would have liked to go back to get the complete wing, but it disappeared by the time we got back.
Well, it's amazing to be able to hold a piece of this in my hand. Do you think we could go back and look at some pictures? Do you have anything like that of the wing when it was still on the island?
We do, and we have the full history of exactly where the aircraft that came from and its relevance and the significance. A Spitfire Mark I wing, this is extremely rare to see, even in today's world.
Oh, I'd love to take a look at that stuff.
So why don't we go up to the office and look at that stuff now?
Sounds great.
Okay.
So Mark, can you show me where exactly on the plane this would have come from?
For an early Mark Spitfire, the wingtip is here, and this is the main component of the wing. And the Spitfire wing is the main spars lying right here, and then the ancillary section was built up of this framework is at the back here. So here is a shot of our Spitfire piece being burned. The naval firefighters, so these were firefighters on Canada's aircraft carriers at that point, were being trained how to deal with aircraft fires.
So they were just considered to be such surplus after the war that they were sent to be burned? Is that sort of what the situation was?
It was being used as a tool to train it. And then the pit that the aircraft was positioned on, and that was the location that they burned it from.
Mark, we've established that this is a Battle of Britain Spitfire, but how did you go about doing that? How do we tie this to that one specific plane?
So it wasn't until we saw a picture of the front of the aircraft being burned, when we saw that the 4 gun ports were there, that told us that this was a Spitfire, and the only one that matched that indication was aircraft number X4555. So knowing the number, because we can see the number at the back of the aircraft, the X455, we looked up the history, and lo and behold, in a number of actions, it actually shot down a Stuka, and it shot down a Messerschmitt 110. So it actually has war history as well as everything else.
Right, so I mean, not only is this an important plane because it was a World War II plane, but it's a particularly important one in terms of the battles it's on, what it accomplished.
In fact, with 92 Squadron based at Biggin Hill in the Battle of Britain, was that there was actually a very good history by a pilot by the name of Jeffrey Wellen, who was called First Light, and he was on the squadron at the same time the Spitfire was, and it's become one of the classic stories, a pilot story about the Battle of Britain. And it's all tied to this one piece of very rusty aluminum.
What sort of journey would have had to take place for this plane and its wing to have made its way to McNabb's Island?
It was built by Supermarine at the Southampton plant, just prior to them moving Spitfire production outside. So there's lots of different threads running here. Obviously issued to 92 Squadron at Biggin Hill, and then it was damaged, but then it was sent through Halifax and ended up in Ottawa. And ultimately one was sent to Stadacona to be a training aid and was disassembled and put in one of the buildings. And this particular one ended up being used as fire training aid. Once that was done, they cast the airframe aside, conjecture it was buried, but certainly by the early 80s, all that was left was the starboard wing.
Is that still there?
Rumors that pieces of it exist in a scrapyard somewhere. Until you actually have a physical piece in your hand, it's very hard to actually, put the dots together. I think it's not every day you find a Battle of Britain Spitfire on an island in Nova Scotia.
Absolutely.
The Spitfire obviously drew the limelight because it was the more pleasant design to look at versus the Hurricane, which was the other fighter that was used. There were 24 marks of Spitfire that were produced. So obviously it had a lot of staying power. The original design was used throughout, right to the end of the war.
Having special access to go beyond museum exhibits reveals some of history's best kept secrets and most interesting stories. Thank you for joining me in this exploration of military artifacts on another episode of Militaria at the museum.